Hello everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am joining with my fellow trash humans to talk about the most disappointing reads of 2019. We're good trash though. Is it good trash? I don't know. I love these videos. If you're watching this, you love these videos too. I'm fascinated by books that don't work for other people, and I'm fascinated by the books that don't work for me. But bearing that in mind, that is why this is the most disappointing books of 2019 rather than the worst. I don't think it's fair to make a judgment call on a book like that, because just because it doesn't work for me doesn't mean it's a bad book. And I really want to focus on books that didn't meet my expectations and why here. I think that is the most healthy way to discuss it. And I'm just excited that I read enough books this year to have 10 disappointing books. That said, some of these are only mildly disappointing, and I am going to go through them in order of, I had some small quibbles that qualify as disappointment, all the way down to, I really didn't like this book. Okay, there's one or two like that. But this is more about disappointing books than anything else. I also have the happy positive counterpoint to this, which is the best books of 2019, i.e. my favorite books of the year, which I will link to down below. And in fact, I borderline cheated and threw in some honorable mentions there, so there's more like 15 great books you could possibly read in that video. But here I'm going to go over 10 disappointing books from 2019 that I read in 2019, starting with The Last Black Unicorn by Tiffany Haddish. This one's going first because it is mild disappointment. I still gave this book 4 stars, so it's not like I didn't like this book. But I was mildly disappointed because, well, I strongly suspect I should have listened to it on audio. There was something about actually reading some of the anecdotes that didn't quite land because they felt like comedy routines. They felt like I should be listening to them, not reading them. And also because Tucker Max, who wrote this book, technically he gets a writing credit. He made some choices in terms of the narration style. There were points where it basically switches into dialogue, where it's like Tiffany : things that she said, person response, rather than doing more narrative focus. There were parts where I basically wanted it to be more narrative than it was, and also there were parts of it that I enjoyed a lot more than other parts. There were a few chapters that really didn't work for me for various reasons. I did go into more detail in my wrap-up video for this book. For all of these books, in fact, I'm going to link you down below to the original wrap-up video that it was featured in so you can hear more of my thoughts. Some of these books, I talked for 10 or 15 minutes about why I had problems with them in those videos, which I won't repeat here, but there were definitely a few chapters in The Last Black Unicorn that I honestly just didn't like. And so it impacted my reading experience, and I expected this to be an unequivocal 5-star, and it just wasn't for me. So it's definitely a book that disappointed me a bit. Next is You Owe Me a Murder by Eileen Cook. This is a YA thriller I read earlier in the year. Again, it's in the mildly disappointing category. Again, it's a trope I really quite like, and it had a lot of good tension in it, but as the story kind of built up and ultimately also started to unravel, there were a few moments in it that felt a little bit unearned, where I wasn't 100% with the narrative and the choices that the characters were making. It's still a good pacey thriller if you like the strangers on a train trope. It just was a little bit disappointing for me. Similarly, A Danger to Herself and Others by Alyssa Scheinmel is a YA thriller that I actually really liked. It was a very satisfying reading experience except for one thing, which is why it's on the mild disappointment side of this list, which is there's a thing I can't say because of spoilers that I expected the book to do. A really big thriller trope that is one of my favorites that honestly is supported in the text. It's a choice the narrative makes in the last third with the main character that basically, because it failed to meet my expectations, means I was disappointed by the book. I think it was a missed opportunity. I think a part of me wondered if it was like an edit situation. Was it supposed to be that way? But then they changed their mind. And that kind of frustration is always going to impact my ultimate satisfaction with a book. So that is why it is on the disappointing side. I do go into spoilers in my wrap-up for the video so you can know exactly the thing. It's also in my review on Goodreads under a spoiler tag, but for the sake of this video, I'm not gonna say it. But because the book, I thought it was setting up this one thing that I really, really like, and it actually set it up really, really well, and then it totally dropped the ball on it, it definitely disappointed me. But honestly, otherwise, if you're not expecting that thing, it might be a 5-star read for you. The only reason it wasn't 5 stars for me is because I really wanted that thing. So it's very subjective. Next is An Unwanted Guest by Shari LaPena. I actually really liked this book because it has one of my ultimate all-time favorite tropes, which is snowed in. You're in an isolated place, and in this case, there's a horrible snowstorm, and of course, someone dies, and it has to be someone who's there, and it's the tension of you can't trust anyone, and someone's a murderer. It's the "and then there were none" trope. I love it. It's actually pretty well done in this book, but why is this book on the disappointing books list? Because, as I covered in my wrap-up, I just don't think I love everything about the way that Shari LaPena executes concepts. I flat out disliked a previous title of hers I read. I liked this one a lot better, but it does one thing that landed it on this list, on the mild end of the list. It has some really cheap tension building in it. I talked about it in my wrap-up video, but what it does specifically, it's multi-POV third person, and it's a lot of POVs. So in a single chapter, you might bounce between 6, 7, 8 different characters, very, very short sections, maybe even just a paragraph or 2 per character, and it can lead to some repetition. So one character is observing something and then it bounces to the next POV and they repeat the same information, but it's about kind of navel gazing and building cheap tension because you have one person observing and worrying and then a different person observing and worrying, and it's the repetition of like the anxiety and the worrying. It really was not my favorite thing. It didn't sit right with me. But it was only annoying in certain parts of the book, which is why overall it was still a good read and a good execution of the trope. But it's on the disappointing books list because it would be a home run for me if it didn't do that thing that really annoys me. Next, right in the middle, so yes, we're going to get to books that really bothered me very soon, but this one still, it's kind of like mid to mild disappointment, this one, and that is The Husband's Secret by Liane Moriarty. Part of the disappointment is the downside of my own expectations, that I had watched Big Little Lies on HBO, but this was the first book of hers that I actually read. It's also one of her older titles, and the happy reality of being a writer, usually if you get to be a career writer, as long as your ego doesn't go to your head, is that you improve with every book. And I bet a more recent title by her is probably amazing, and in fact I bought one recently that I do plan on reading, but there was something about this book where it just wasn't as great as I wanted it to be. And specifically, it did two things that I cover in my wrap-up again. I think this is one where I talk for 15 minutes about this book, so I'm going to link to that down below. But the short version is, it had some issues with fat phobia that actively bothered me as I was reading. I do talk about it in the wrap-up where my conflict was, well, was the character being fat phobic used to try to make that character unlikable, or is it actually a reflection of what the author believes? And I never arrived at a real conclusion, but it doesn't change the fact that I was actively uncomfortable for part of the book because it says over and over again that this character, particular character, was fat and unattractive and unlovable when she was fat, and now she's thin and can be happy. It's fine. It's a me thing. And then the book lands on some ableism. It has an issue with ableism that I covered in depth in that review. But this is why, for those 2 reasons, it did these 2 things that I found disappointing. It got in the way of what was otherwise a pretty satisfying domestic suspense novel. So that is where I landed on The Husband's Secret by Liane Moriarty. It had some real barriers to my enjoying it as much as I wanted to. Next is another memoir, and it is The Bedwetter by Sarah Silverman. And I just found wide swaths of this book really boring and pointless, which partly, I think it's just changing times and illustrates that not all memoirs are evergreen. This memoir is almost 10 years old at this point, and so there are parts of it that just I shrugged my shoulder at. It had some good setup. I liked knowing about Sarah Silverman and her childhood, but it gets just very twee and too cute toward the end, talking about things that I didn't care about and I also didn't find particularly funny. So as a memoir, this just really fell flat for me and definitely counts as a disappointing read because I did go into it expecting to like it a lot more than I did. Okay, it's happening. The last 4 on the list are books that I really lean toward I didn't like. It's really scary to talk about these even though I've already done full reviews of these, so you know that I had serious problems with each of the last 4 books that I'm going to talk about, but still, I'm going to gird my loins. So the next disappointing book was Good Girls Lie by J.T. Ellison. This is a boarding school thriller. It's multi-POV, and despite being a boarding school thriller where a majority of the POV is technically from the POV of a teenager, the reason why this was so disappointing for me is that it's an adult thriller and it's positioned as an adult thriller, so at least they didn't try to say it was YA. But I really didn't like the YA POV. I'm a YA reader, I'm a YA writer, and the character who is supposed to be a 16-year-old girl doesn't ever feel like a 16-year-old girl. So wide swaths of the text just felt really off. It also just hitting my personal quibbles, because this is fully subjective, is so wrong about college admissions that it made me upset. It was a barrier to me enjoying this. That is the way to put it. Now, as I covered in my review of this in my wrap-up, there were actually things about this book that I really, really liked. My favorite parts of the book were the actual adult POVs. There's one from the dean's POV and there's one from a police detective's POV, and if more of the book had been from their POVs, I would have liked it more because it would have sat properly in its own category. Another problem I had with it, again, disappointments, is the book is set now, but feels like it should be set in 1990. Its use of technology, of the way that each of the characters talked, as much as I liked the dean, she's my age, but talks like a mom, like a boomer. She talks like a boomer. And so there were just multiple levels of disconnect where it's like, I wish the book had been set in the 90s and had been firmly an adult book, but being presented to me in the year 2019 as an adult thriller with a teen character set now, I just had too many problems with it, honestly. It was a disappointment because it's literally a checklist of all the things I like, and it just didn't work for me. It's gothic as well. It has some serious gothic elements to it, again, that I really, really liked. So it's essentially, a book is a cocktail of a bunch of different ingredients, and there were a few ingredients in this one, or the way that it was shaken, or the glass that it was put in, I don't know, that basically made the drink not work for me, even though I liked a lot of the collective ingredients in it. I think that's the best way to put it. Next, similarly, an adult thriller with a lot of tropes I liked that just had some issues in execution that really kept me from enjoying it the way I wanted to. And that is The Secrets They Left Behind by Lissa Marie Redmond. And this one was in my most recent wrap-up. You may know it's basically small town secrets with a cop who's very young looking. She's 23, but she looks younger, going undercover for the FBI in this small town where these 3 girls have disappeared in order to get close to the girls' friends to try to solve the mystery of their disappearance. Again, this one, the cocktail ingredients were correct, but it had some issues with execution, specifically character soup, kind of, where there were all of these characters, young characters, who I had trouble telling them apart because they didn't have completely distinct personalities. There were a lot of essentially YA tropes. These are like stereotypical 18-year-old character types, but not all of them stood out to me. And then I had a problem with the predictability of the mystery thriller element. Again, I go into full spoilers in my wrap-up for this one, which I will link to down below, but that's essentially it. There's getting ahead of the narrative and kind of making really good guesses, and there's calling it from the first page where the villain appears, and I don't like being that correct. So I had some issues with essentially the building of the suspense and the unfolding of the suspense, where ultimately I just didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. I also had major problems with the romance, which actually was a major thread in the book. It had some really toxic elements, toxic masculinity, which made it really, really difficult for me to root for the main couple and for the main character and the love interest. So between some issues with the execution of the mystery and the thriller and just flat out not liking the romance, I just didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to, even though I really liked the tropes. That said, I still enjoyed the reading experience. I went back to the book each night. I did want to read it. I liked the setting. The small town secrets part of the trope was pretty well done. Like, I liked the small town and a lot of the politics, but ultimately it just didn't work for me as a romantic suspense novel. And now we get to end on the two books that I had really strong feelings for. If you've watched my wrap-ups, you know what these are. So the first one is The Woman in the Window by A.J. Finn. Now, I did give this 4 stars on Goodreads. You can see the process of me processing this book in my reading vlog, and I also talk about it in my wrap-up. But basically, the author of The Woman in the Window is a garbage human. Like, I'm not making that up. Like, there was this huge expose in the New Yorker of decades of lies, lying about his mom dying of cancer and lying about himself having a brain tumor. I'm talking like fabricating emails and lying to people over years and inventing parts of his resume. Like, he's a pathological liar and a grifter, and yet sold this book and is a multimillionaire because this book is hugely successful. So a part of me wanted to read it out of curiosity because it was so popular, but I really don't want to support the author. So I ended up buying it used for $2. It's in the video. He didn't get any of my money. But reading it was a really interesting experience because I actually liked like 80% of the book. And parts of it are incredibly well written, which is why I thought it would be unfair to give this like a low star rating just because, but this is why it's on the list. Genuinely, hugely disappointing read. Verging on, I don't think it's a great book because the ending is terrible. It's unsupported. It's not well built up through the text. There's no characterization, character arc or foreshadowing. And so the ending was like, excuse me? And a bad ending, a poorly supported ending, especially when it comes to characters, that kills a book for me. And so this was the second to last not great book I read this year. The ending of this book ruined an aspect of the reading experience for me. Even though I'd enjoyed a lot of the book up to that point, I'm like, oh no, I don't like this book because it faceplants so hard on the ending and made me feel better about not liking the author as a person. So yeah, that's why this is on the list. I think that it's basically paint by numbers adult thriller. It hits all of the points. It's almost like he made a checklist going, I'm gonna write a best-selling adult thriller. And he definitely ticked off the list, but there was something missing in the book. The characters don't feel like real people. And ultimately, that's what really killed it for me. I'll tell you, a book that's just kind of okay can be elevated to amazing for me if I have a really good, emotionally immediate reading experience where the characters feel whole and real and specific and have an interesting arc. I'm a character-driven reader, so this is just a great example of a case where honestly I think the characters are weak. They exist to fuel the plot rather than the other way around, and so that is why this book was just a thumbs down for me. And last but certainly not least, the most disappointing book of 2019 for me was Dear Wife by Kimberly Bell. It's really hard to talk about this book because the reason I really didn't like it is both subjective but also objective in some ways. So the sad thing is that on the thriller end of things, it's actually a pretty well-constructed thriller. It's got multi-POVs, you have a slight unreliable narrator situation going on, like the case where you are trying to piece together like who each POV is and how they connect, and that aspect of it was pretty well done. I will say, Kimberly Bell's previous book, I had some issues with it. There were things about it that I felt were a little bit racially insensitive, but I kind of gaslit myself and was like, oh, maybe I imagined that. But then when I read this book, I did find multiple instances One of racism and fatphobia that I wasn't a big fan of, I was pretty uncomfortable about. And then a thread in the book of transphobia. There's a late game reveal. I'm putting this in quotes because it has literally nothing to do with the plot. It's only used as a cheap gotcha bugaboo moment at the end involving a specific character, and it's completely unnecessary in my opinion. You find out that a character who has just existed as a female character is a trans woman. The way that this is done and written is really dehumanizing, and honestly, it's pointless, and that was my problem with it. It contributes absolutely nothing to any character development or growth or plot. You could argue that it's partly there to make the bad person seem like an even worse person, except the heroic character, the one we're supposed to empathize with and follow through the narrative, also has these dehumanizing thoughts about this person, so it just was icky all around. I wasn't a big fan of it. I did send the publisher a note about it because it frankly would have been so easy to fix because it had nothing to do with the plot of the novel. It would change literally zip nada nothing to remove that aspect of the book, to not have the character, I don't even want to say it, the way it was done, it left a bad taste in my mouth. But ultimately the book was published as is, and it left that bad taste in my mouth. It overrode any enjoyment I had of the thriller as a whole, because it really put off the entire third act for me, because I was like, why did that happen? So it ruined the reading experience for me, and I did point it out in my Goodreads review and in my wrap-up video on the book, because I do think readers have a right to know that it has this transphobia in it. The racism is almost secondary to the transphobia, though in her previous book, it was a little racist. So that's why ultimately Dear Wife was the most disappointing read of 2019 for me. I definitely had an emotional experience reading it. I was enjoying the thriller part, and then I got hit in the face first with the awkward racial and like fat phobic part, and I was like, oh, okay. But the transphobia is what really took the cake for me, and it was the way that it was written and the fact that it had nothing to contribute to the plot. Yeah, so that's where I landed on Dear Wife, and those are the 10 most disappointing books of 2019 for me. I know we all hate endless disclaimers on videos like this, but seriously, these are all just my subjective opinions. I tried to be pretty clear about when things just didn't reach my expectations, but where you might like any number of these books. Let me know down below in the comments, what was your most disappointing read of 2019, though let's be nice, and give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make this a tradition every year, provided I read enough books to have books that I was disappointed in. Last year I just didn't have enough, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always guys, happy reading.